Welcome to the Counterplan lecture. I'm going to be uploading this on the Discord, but if you'd like a copy of this, feel free to send me an email and I'll get you the link. So we're going to be talking about counterplans today, centered around the criminal justice reform topic. Let's just get started. So here's what we're going to be going over today. First part is going to be parts of the counterplan. Second is how counterplans compete with AFFS. Third, Counterplan NEG Strategies. Fourth, types of counterplans. And 5, AFFS responses to the counterplan. So I know y'all like agendas, so hopefully this is helpful. Let's go to parts of a counterplan. So there's 3 main parts to a counterplan. First is the text. It's a 1-sentence to 1-paragraph summary of the recommended policy action. So this is the thing that you're most familiar with. This is also in the Abolish ICE packet. But it's basically just another plan read on the NEG. So if you think of the affirmative as reading a plan text, then a counterplan is just a plan text written by the NEG. Second part is the solvency. So the counterplan aims to solve some or all of the AFFS advantages. It's basically just you do it great or maybe not that great, but the counterplan does it better. That's the whole attitude of the NEG. Next is the net benefits. We're going to talk more about this, I guess, in the DISAD lecture. But the counterplan avoids the DISAD. These two work hand in hand, so the afternoon lecture should talk a little bit more about this. But basically, the counterplan solves for something that the DISAD links to the affirmative. So yeah. So the counterplan avoids the DISAD that is caused by enacting the plan. So again, the net benefit to the counterplan is that the DISAD doesn't apply to the counterplan, but it applies to the affirmative, right? So next, let's talk about how the counterplans compete with the affirmatives. I think we're still, sorry, am I going a little bit too fast, y'all? Maybe in the chat? Okay, cool. Second part. Cool. So how do counterplans compete with the affirmatives? Counterplans are basically a NEG strategy that neutralizes the 1AC and it refocuses the debate on the NEG, right? So if you think of the role of the affirmative as like, hey, here's a plan, we think this is a great idea, please pass it, right? The counterplan is like, hey, actually, that may be not such a great idea. Let's refocus on like what I want to talk about, right? Kind of like what Rick said yesterday, it's kind of great being NEG because all you have to do is like the app is bad. But counterplan is just presenting a way that they could do the app better. So sometimes the 1AC is right about having the problem they identify, right? Sometimes when you're negative, you tend to think that you have to say the opposite of whatever the other team is saying, but really, you could agree with what the app's saying and they could be correct with the problem, right? And the 1ACs, their intent is really to be effective at claiming the moral high ground, right? They'll have a lot of impacts, like appealing to your empathy about why we should be helping X, Y, and Z or these marginalized groups. And it's kind of messed up to contest them in a way. So for example, like if you say that like children shouldn't be in prison, right? A NEG argument, it's really hard to argue like, well, children should be in prison, right? So those are not the route that we want to go to. So that's just like what the app is saying. So you don't want to make those type of arguments. What counterplan allowed you to do is to compete in this situation and refocus the debate on the issue of your choice, right? Again, this is why it's great being an egg, because the app could be like, hey, I want to talk about this thing, right? But the thing with multiple off cases is that the NEG wants to talk about how many things they want to talk about, right? It could be one thing, it could be a specific type of K, it could be multiple things, right? It could be like 8 off, right? All those 8 off cases are all things that the NEG wants to kind of refocus on, right? So counterplan is just another strategy that the NEG can use throughout the debate. So now, on the third part, counterplan NEG strategies. An effective strategy has 2 main options. One, they neutralize or turn the AFF advantages, right? What a turn means, we'll talk about like what turn means, but basically it says like, hey, you think that you cause these good things to happen, but either you cause those bad things, or the good thing that you're actually talking about doesn't actually happen. So defensive case arguments could be like, oh, you don't have any solvency, you don't have any impact, or there are alternative causes to the impacts that the AFFS is explaining, right? So sometimes what the affirmatives will aim to do is say, well, here's the problem, right, that we identify, and we identify a solution to that problem via the plan, right? What the counterplan aims to do is like, hey, we agree with the problem that you're identifying, but we disagree with the type of solution that you're presenting to solve that problem, right? That hence the counterplan. And with that, like when the NEG is presenting that, the reason why a disad is really important is because the disad is what the judge needs to consider in order to vote neg, right? If you have two competing plans, right, we'll kind of talk about like permutations toward the end of the lecture, right? But the disadvantage is really just offense against the permutation, right? So that's really the first main part. The second part is you need to win massive external offense, right? The disadvantages or critiques that has a net benefit to your counterplan or alts, right? So this is what external offense means. Like maybe it's like, this is what external offense means, right? The disad external offense, if you think about it like an off case argument, right? If you go on case, you're usually turning the arguments of the affirmative, but when you're talking about external offense, the neg is presenting exterior evidence and exterior information apart from the affirmative that says like the plan will cause more bad things to happen, right? So those are two main goals of counterplans. So for you, neg. Cool. Now let's get to the type of counterplans. If y'all taking notes, this will take like the majority, or at least like a good chunk of your time. So you want to like maybe space out some of your notes. So we're going to go over three main counterplans. The first two are just going to be like one slide, but the ADR counterplan going to take a little bit longer. So however you're spacing that out, just keep that in mind. So for the criminal justice reform topic, there's really going to be three main counterplans. First is a reform counterplan. Second are like abolition type of counterplans, and third, agent counterplans. I'm going to be talking about this pretty broadly because the counterplans that you may encounter or create throughout the year would sound a little bit different and look a little bit different. So I'm going to be talking about these holistically, and we're going to kind of work to identify like which counterplan these or which affirmatives that each of these counterplans apply to. So, oops. So first, let's talk about the reform counterplan. These will be popular strategies against teams that may try to abolish some aspect of the criminal justice reform system that is run exclusively by the federal government, right? This includes AFFS that have like abolish immigration, abolish ICE, right? Or that has to do with like the DEA or the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, right? These counterplans will usually be run alongside some sort of like crime DA, right? So for example, if somebody's passing a plan like we should abolish the police, we should abolish ICE, right? Somebody would run a counterplan that says like, actually, maybe we don't need to abolish it, we need to kind of reform, right? Because for example, crime, somebody from the varsity group brought this up. It's like, how do we contest with the moral high ground, right? It's like we know about police violence, we know about systemic violence by the police, right? So how do we argue about the crime, right? So with like the crime disad, they're usually going to be arguing like, what do we do about like these morally corrupt like people and things that happen, for example, like sex trafficking, right? Or just like or human trafficking with like migrant children, right? So these type of arguments would center and kind of turn that moral high ground and say like, well, we understand that there may be systemic issues, but we can't just like abolish something without having a solution, because there are other problems that even though institutionally they may be bad, or they may be causing harm, but the reform counterplan and also the crime disad would argue was like, well, they're still doing some good because no one else are solving these type of crimes, right? So they're not going to really argue that they're good in total or holistically, right? But maybe the crime disad would focus on the impacts of like human trafficking or of human trafficking, for example, right? So this would be one pivot that people running the reform counterplan would probably try to argue. Cool. Oh, the CJR just stands for criminal justice reform. So if I use that, it's just talking about the topic about sentencing, policing, and forensic science. So if I'm using any other like acronyms that y'all don't know, please let me know, because I don't want y'all to be lost during the lecture. So next, abolition counterplan. So abolition counterplan, this will be popular against teams that run like some sort of reform aspect, right? That is run exclusively by the USFG. And I'm going to keep emphasizing the USFG because we'll talk about the agent counterplan and how these are a little bit more specific, right? So it's really good to specify that the reform counterplan and abolition counterplan they apply to affirmatives that just use the USFG as a whole or really don't specify a specific branch. So if you want to like make that note for when these type of counterplans are going to be applied, I would suggest doing that. Again, these counterplans are usually run alongside critiques that says like the agency or system in question is like irredeemable or they must be eliminated rather than reformed, right? That's really the whole point too of like the abolition counterplan. It's like, hey, we know that this was corrupt and we should just be abolishing it instead of reforming it because there's no point in reform. I think during the K lecture in the chat, I was mentioning that people don't really understand or know how long ICE has been around. And I actually came across this fact on Twitter of all places. But yeah, like ICE was created in 2003. And the Fast and Furious movie, like the Fast and Furious franchise, was created in 2001. So if you put that in context, like the Fast and Furious movies are older than ICE, right? Some of y'all are like, or I think most of you are born after those years, right? So this has been your normal. But like the abolition counterplan is really aiming to center like, this isn't really normal, maybe in your lifetime, right? But abolition isn't just like a faraway dream. It's actually something that we can imagine and kind of take place, right? Everybody kind of has this misconception about abolition, like, you know, anarchy and kind of all those things. But I guess we can discuss this like maybe more in our individual lab or the Q&A discussion. But that's really what it's aiming to do. It's like we should be getting rid of these agencies and allocating kind of like other resources to other organizations that can take place of these federal agencies, for example, right? There are a lot of like disadvantages to this, for example, and again, this can be run with other critiques, right? Talking about impacts, about how policing just impacts Black and Brown communities more than others. So yeah. Next, we're going to go to agent counterplan. Isn't the Titanic older than ICE? Yeah, the Titanic's older than ICE, but I feel like the Fast and Furious is a little bit like catchier because, I mean, the cars and the outfits are pretty cool. So, yeah, let's talk about agent counterplans. So these are strategies. Again, these will be popular against plans in which the federal government incentivizes criminal justice reform at the state and local level. That's what I want to emphasize. Agent counterplans is trying to reform something on the state and local level. So if you think about the three branches of government, we have executive, we have legislative, and we have Congress, right? So any plan that kind of like specifies one of these three branches, you would want to maybe pick and choose one of these, right? So the types of affirmatives that this counterplan will apply to would be, you know, the body cam affirmatives, you know, school to prison pipeline, and stop and frisk. And the reason why like we were kind of identifying these affirmatives is because not all cities, not all states implement these laws, right? So you can't really enforce or implement a law that doesn't exist in the first place or already exists. So when we're talking like about, yeah, so that's why when you kind of hear these type of affirmatives, when you know it's not applied on the federal level, you should kind of assume that it is an agent type of affirmative and you should be running an agent counterplan. So 50 states counterplan, the US Constitution like dedicates the vast majority of police power to the 50 states and localities, right? If you kind of think about and also look up like the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars that we invest into police, you know, you can kind of look up how much we invest. And whatever leverage that the federal government has pales in comparison to the states, right? This counterplan is usually run alongside the federalism dissad or politics dissad. So what is this basically saying? It's like, hey, big government, nah, right? Let the states handle themselves. Let them decide, right? We agree with your plan, but we don't agree with the way that you're implementing it, right? The argument really consists of, it's like, you know, big government is bad. If anything's overreaching, they might have some like totalitarianism types of arguments, right? And or even saying that it's more effective on the state level because more people in even like conservative states would be more receptive to those type of like laws passing, right? So that's usually the gist of the counterplan. So when you kind of look at, talk about like the federalism this that or like politics this that, it's the same thing. Like when we're talking about like big government, you know, the federalism this that and the politics this that, it has to do with like how politically, I guess, like how much that is like politicized, right? I don't even use like mass as an example because like to me like mass shouldn't be, you know, politicized. It's just common sense, but it'd be like that sometimes. So next, let's talk about the Supreme Court counterplan. This is used if the actor is Congress, right? And the reason why this is used is because like Supreme Court justices are shielded from political pressure. So if a counterplan talks about like, hey, we should pass this through Congress because it could be implemented by a law, right? If you're encountering an affirmative that has this type of counterplan, what the Supreme Court counterplan aims to do is like, hey, we get that these things are written into law, but also people in Congress are politicians, and you know they'll argue that they're self-serving, and they could talk. So they could talk about how they're more likely to just kind of like bend to political pressure and like maybe even corruption because they are elected officials, and there's also history of corruption in the U.S. government and politics, right? So with the Supreme Court, the argument is that like, hey, the Supreme Court, they're there for life. They don't really have any motivation besides just like protecting the Constitution and people in the United States. So that's really the main argument for the Supreme Court counterplan. And again, this is read with the politics aside. Again, the politics aside would usually argue, like it's kind of like similar to the elections aside, but it basically argues that like, if you vote off, it's going to skew the politics, or in some way it's going to affect, or it will have a domino effect on other policies that are like aiming to reform or whatever else, right? So that's the gist of the politics aside. Next, the Congress counterplan. Again, this is used again if the AFFS actor is the Supreme Court. Again, like this is just really the flip side of the Supreme Court. So it says if the plan is too political, it hurts the legitimacy of the court, right? This, I guess you can kind of apply to what's happening right now and what's happening in our current political climate, right? If you're kind of like passing a plan that the majority of the United States or a lot of conservatives disagree with, a lot of the arguments are going to say that, you know, the legitimacy of the court is too skewed liberally or conservatively. So, you know, we should pass it by Congress because we, at least it's our own elected official, right? Supreme Court, they are picked by someone that we already elected. So via Congress, at least, like there is more of a majority vote amongst people, right? So that's really the main argument of like a Congress counterplan, and it's really just to apply it to the court's counterplan. And again, this is run via the court legitimacy aside. Again, like the main gist of the court legitimacy aside is to kind of say that if people don't have faith in the court anymore, and then that means like our constitution and our society kind of collapses because like nothing really matters. There's no like democracy. There's no like democratic process. Yeah. So yeah. So again, all these counterplans are like you deal with it or like let them deal with it. So that's kind of like the gist of that. SpongeBob is older than I am. Oh yeah, SpongeBob came out in like 99 or like 98, right? Mammoth. Yeah, Ice Age. Is CP always tied with DA? Thank you for that question, Patrick. Please remind me of that like toward the end of the discussion. I was like, I don't want to like my brain, like, you know, brain fart happens sometimes. Cool. next, let's get to theoretical issues, right? So I kind of like this really neat to-do list. It's like, what does the NEG really need to do, right? Because the NEG's only job is to prove that the AFF is a bad plan, right? The NEG doesn't have to stick to their CP until the end of the debate. If y'all stuck around for the discussion yesterday after the K, we kind of talked about conditionality and unconditionality and kind of like the morality and like ethics tied to it because it's tied to identity and those type of arguments, right? But what I'm referring to are theoretical issues and procedural issues in debate and kind of like the rules and games of policy debate, right? And what the NEG aims to do. So again, the conditions under which like yeah, so let's kind of go down the next to-do list, right? First, you just need to prove that the app is bad. The app is like, great idea. NEG is like, nah, it's a bad idea and you shouldn't vote app, right? You need to decide if the counterplan is unconditional and you have to decide if the counterplan is conditional. I'll go over this in the next slide, but you also have to answer the question, what's the status of the counterplan? I know that like this is usually a question that a lot of like younger novices and JV folks are afraid to answer or ask or even know what that means, right? And there's be like yes or no, or just kind of say something because they didn't really know. So we'll kind of go over what the status of the counterplan is, but really your answer should be like conditional or unconditional. So it should be really one of those two answers. If you kind of say things like, well, I don't know yet, right? To me, that indicates like a moving target type of argument where the NEG kind of does like kind of flip-flops, and at least as the affirmative, you should be asking this question, but I don't want to confuse y'all right yet. But again, as a NEG, you have to decide whether or not the counterplan is unconditional or conditional when the affirmative asks in cross-ex, what is the status of the counterplan? Again, the only thing that the NEG does not have to do is stick with their CP till the end of the debate. If the AFF is like, hey, you can't drop the counterplan, and the NEG is like, oh, I guess I can't drop the counterplan, and they decided to extend the counterplan, the NEG is just listening to the affirmative, right? So sometimes this happens in debates where one team or one debater is a little bit more experienced and they're like, hey, you can't do that, the rules of the debate. Well, people can say things with confidence all the time, right? You could just turn on the news and they could still be really wrong. So don't be afraid to like question those things, right? Michaela, why would we need to drop CP? Cool, thank you. Again, I'm gonna put this in the like list of questions for this discussion later because these are like really excellent and really great questions. So yeah, on the next slide, we're gonna go over what conditionality means and what unconditionality means. So what's the status of the counterplan, right? Sometimes it sends like chills down your spine if you don't know what those things mean, right? So let's go over unconditional. So the NEG is stuck with the counterplan. There is no condition under which like the negative will stop advocating for the counterplan. And in other words, the counterplan will be in the 2NR. And the negative is no longer able to advocate for the status quo, right? This is what I want to emphasize. If you're talking about an unconditional counterplan, you're saying, hey, I'm going to extend this until the 2NR. So if I'm saying an unconditional, you better be preparing for this argument because we're just saying we're not moving, right? If you have an unconditional counterplan, if you have unconditional K, you're just saying like, yeah, this argument, that's it, we're not dropping it, right? And because you're saying those things and you're saying that in cross-lex, you're saying that in your speech, the NEG can't advocate for the SCO anymore. And the reason why I want to point this out is because the job of the NEG, right, if it's to prove that the affirmative is bad, you don't have to present a counterplan. I know this is the lecture about counterplan, but the NEG is just like, hey, the plan is bad, it's the SCO, let's just not do anything because the status quo is better, right? But if you're saying that you're sticking with an unconditional counterplan, you really believe in this counterplan and you're gonna argue it toward the end of the debate, until the end of the debate, right? So with that said, like you can't really argue for the SCO anymore because that would just be kind of like turning yourself, and also the affirmative can make educational and like unfairness arguments and like bad for education because you're kind of saying one thing and you're saying another when the other team is really just trying to clarify what you're going to be arguing, right? So the AFF should never complain about an unconditional counterplan. This is really important because yeah, like if someone says that they're unconditional, they're just basically telling you it's like, hey, this is the argument that we're going to go for. We're not going to be trying to trick you. We're not going to be kicking out of something. And we really care about this argument, so you better prep for it, right? So those are the only conditions that like something would be like unconditional. By default, the neg, a typical example in most of like these typical policy rounds are neg is conditional, right? So let's get to the conditional part. There's no condition under which the neg must commit to a counterplan. I want to emphasize this, like those things happen in debate, but the rules of the debate doesn't require the negative to just hold you accountable to the counterplan, right? Like the counterplan, the arguments that you read do not stick to you round to round, right? Maybe like a debater or an opponent just like made you feel really bad, or or is this like one debate kind of like traumatized you a little bit, but you don't have to commit to a counterplan. Yeah, so in other words, counterplan may not be extended in the 2NC, the 1NR meaning the block, or the 2NR. It's basically like, hey, this is one of our many arguments. We're just trying to like throw things at the app, whether or not it's a good idea. We're not really sure if it's a great idea yet. We're just trying to see and test the app, right? Because that's what the neg is aiming to do. They're like, hey, in a conditional world with multiple worlds, when we're talking about multiple world arguments, this is also talking about conditional arguments, right? So different terms, but they all mean the same thing. The neg's role doesn't have to be consistent because it's the job of the app to be able to shield their plan, you know, their baby from like all criticism, right? So the neg gets to contradict themselves because in order to like pass a law, pass a plan, right, it has to pass some sort of like a list of criticisms. And if you think about this, it's like the list of off cases and the list of arguments that the negative has. Yeah, so the app's arguments usually to this, right, if they talk about like conditionality, usually this question is asked like, what's the status of the counterplan? The 2AC ask the 1AC this, the 2AC, okay, repeat that, brain fart. The 1AC ask the 1NC the question, what's the status of the counterplan, right? And the 1NC should be answering unconditional or conditional. So yeah. Again, this is pretty annoying for the app to deal with because they don't know what to expect and how to allocate their time, but it'd be like that sometimes, and like that's how debate is, right? That's why we have the neg block, and the reason why we have the affirmative going first and last in the debate, and the reason why we have the neg block is in order to kind of even it out, right? So like the neg overwhelms the 1AR with a lot of arguments, the 1AR ends up dropping something, but also the app gets to go last in the debate. That's also why if you were listening to Joseph F. lecture, he's talking about how like if you're not lying, you're not trying, and that is the 2A motto, and I was also a 2A, so yeah, it do be like that. So the app people usually complain that like conditionality is unfair and uneducational, and depending the way that this is debated, like many judges may find it persuasive. So that's really just of like unconditional and conditional arguments, right? And you just want to be careful and how you answer these things and how you argue them, because even if you kind of know what they mean, it's easy to get lost and say contradicting things. So it's really great to just kind of clarify these things. So next, let's talk about responses to CP. This will be the last slide, and then we're going to be going on to a short 5-minute break and then the discussion and Q&A session. So yep, let's go. So what should the app do to answer this perm? We should spit on it. Right, I love these little terms, right? This actually came from the POST acronym, permutation, often solvency theory. Some of you are familiar with that, or some of your lab leaders may have learned it that way. I didn't learn it that way, and I didn't learn answering counterplans that way, but like a lot of the people that I talked to apparently learned what POST meant. So I asked for help explaining it. So shout out to Dr. Joel Villeneuve from CSUN for helping me with this, because he said he didn't know what POST meant either. So we came up with a new acronym, which was SPIT, and I think it's kind of funny because you're like spitting on the counterplan. So yeah, I only add this part, and I will only kind of like add that fact because I want you to know it's okay to ask for help, right? Your lab leaders, your teachers, your educators are not all knowing beings. Like we don't know everything, right? Even if like we know argumentation, we don't know the answer to everything. So don't restrict yourself to not learning by like not asking questions, because you may think that everybody else knows about it, right? We all kind of need help, and like I both ended up knowing that we both know POST and kind of came up with this. So really great ideas if you just kind of like throw it out there. So let's kind of get into it. So first, solvency deficit. This is why the counterplan can solve for one or more of the impacts on the 1AC, right? So if you are the affirmative, you need to explain why the counterplan is unable to solve for one or more parts that you laid out. You know, if you're the 1AC, you may have may have multiple advantages, right? And sometimes, and you should be arguing that the counterplan doesn't solve for all of these advantages. And you know, and that leads me to the next part, right? So for actually go back to solvency deficit. Again, the example here is like if you have, if you're reading like an abolish ICE affirmative against a reform ICE counterplan, right? You might say that the counterplan doesn't solve for the ethnic cleansing advantage, right? Because any attempt to reform the agency is doomed to fail, and that's our whatever evidence that is, right? If you look in your file, I don't think that this is explicitly named like ethnic cleansing counter advantage, but in one of the tags and some of the arguments, that is that's what the abolish ICE evidence is saying, right? So you always want to promote, it's like, hey, the counterplan doesn't actually solve enough. Us as the affirmative, we spit on the counterplan by solving more, right? You don't solve enough of our plan. So you should be really highlighting the solvency deficits. Next is a permutation. I also have a separate lecture in PowerPoint that I could also upload. Maybe y'all want to do that in lab because it's a whole separate lecture of like what type of permutations are, how to answer it as the how to argue it as the affirmative, and how to argue it against as the negative. So I'm just going to briefly go over this here. But permutations, they're a test whether or not there is really a forced choice between the plan and the counterplan, right? This is logically similar to saying the counterplan doesn't link to our affirmative, and the most typical perm that you'll hear is perm do both, right? In the other permutations, we get more specific into the types of perms, meaning like intrinsic perm, severance perm, those type of permutations. But if you hear like perm do both, all the AFFS is really saying is like, these things aren't mutually exclusive, meaning they can both happen at the same time, right? Our plan and the counterplan can happen at the same time, so you shouldn't be voting down the affirmative. You should be actually voting for the affirmative because we can coexist, right? And the neg is like, nah, we can't coexist. But the AF in the permutation is always saying that like, yes, we can coexist. That's why we could vote AF, right? The perm is an AF argument. Next, inquire. This is just an emphasis to ask what is the status of the counterplan. This is really, really, really important as the affirmative, because if you don't ask this question, you don't really hold the negative accountable. This is why like cross-ex is not just another like speech to give your argument, right? It's a strategic way that you should be asking your opponent these type of questions, because it is accountability in the round, right? Your judge is listening. And they should be flowing, right? But if they're not flowing, they should be at least listening to cross-ex. And if you're asking these questions like very clearly, what is the status of the counterplan? And the neg goes, look, I don't know. It's like, so you're just going to flip-flop, right? If you kind of like say those terms or moving target, you should be kind of like forcing the neg to be answering unconditional or conditional, whatever. And the reason why the affirmative should be inquiring about this, right, is because you would know whether or not to expect that at the end of the debate. And the argument is like, well, if it is conditional, we know that we might need to allocate our time answering the block to all these other off cases and all these other negative arguments, right, if the counterplan is conditional. If the counterplan is unconditional, we can expect that we need to focus on this counterplan because the negative is going to extend it throughout the debate. This is why it's really important for the affirmative to ask the 1NC this, whether or not they are conditional or unconditional. And we can kind of talk a little bit more in the Q&A discussion session about the arguments against, like, if people don't really answer this question, or they kind of like flip-flop, or kind of they change their mind toward the middle or like end of the debate, right? So yeah, again, this must be done in cross-examination, because you won't be able to read you won't be able to read the answer to these questions by reading their evidence, right? This is why you need to ask these things, because they are not written in the tags, they're not written in the evidence, right? This is strategically picked by the negative team, whether or not they are conditional or unconditional when it comes to the counterplan. And I want to also emphasize that different different arguments, different off cases can be conditional one way or the other. Just because a team says that a counterplan could be conditional, they could also, the NEG could also say that the K is unconditional, right? So the conditionality, unconditionality doesn't really apply to just all of the negative strategy, right? They can kind of pick and choose which one they can decide. And that really is the advantage of the negative in the role of policy debate, right? Those are kind of like the rules of the game in order to test the affirmative. Next, talk about theory. Procedural objections to the counterplan. Again, these are arguments that do not take a stance on the subject, on the substance of the counterplan, right? When we're talking about theory, it's kind of like, hey, wait, stop the debate, right? Before we even get to the content of whatever you're saying, right? We kind of have to talk about procedural fairness. We need to talk about like the rules and how this debate came to be, right? Like we get it, you're gonna read that, but like, stop time, judge. Like we need to evaluate whether or not this debate should be taking place in the first place, right? So the theory doesn't really argue, does the counterplan solve? Is there a net benefit that outweighs the solvency deficit, etc.? These arguments are not in theory, right? Instead, they claim the NEG didn't follow proper procedure, and therefore the substance of their arguments cannot be considered. Meaning it's like, hey, you broke some of these rules, so before we even like debate you, you have to like adhere to some of these rules because it's like unfair, and you'd have a lot of other arguments supporting that claim, right? You can always identify theory arguments because they'll be impacted in terms of fairness and education, right? So theory arguments is like, hey, this debate is unfair to begin with. It's unfair because of these reasons, and also because it's unfair, right? We are not like, we're not getting our education, right? You'll have other educational impacts. So example of theory arguments include, conditionality is bad, or like agent counterplans are bad because, hyper-specifying the affirmative is just like a lot of burden, a lot of burden for the NEG. There's like infinite number of affirmatives, blah, blah, blah. So this type of rhetoric is usually like a theory type of argument, right? So anything specifying like why the plan or why the affirmative is abusive in some sort of way is probably a theory argument. So yeah, really that's the end of the lecture. Sorry if that went a little bit long, but again, thank you for tuning in. Can y'all hear me fine? Cool. I guess that we could just get started, and thank you for those list of questions. Let's see. Cool. I guess very short. Inquire. Why is inquire in parentheses? That was just funny because like Joel just came up with spit and it needed an I, and we just thought of inquire because you could ask like what conditionality is. So it's not really like something that it's like a separate argument, but it's something you should be asking in cross-ex, right? So good question. So Patrick asked, is the counterplan always tied with the DA, and can we use a different off-case argument to back up our CP? Great question. So like if you kind of look at the abolition counterplan, for example, right? In that example, you could that could be run alongside a K, right? So any type of critique. And it doesn't always have to be tied to like a disad, but that's what it's traditionally used for, right? So when you're talking about policy debate in the traditional sense, a counterplan and a DA go hand in hand because they're kind of two parts of a whole. If you don't have a reason to compete with the affirmative, right? If you don't have a disadvantage to the affirmative's plan, right? Then you're not really competing because the NEG's job is to prove it's a bad idea or to advocate for the status quo. And with that, you need to have like evidence or disadvantages to that. With that said, like you don't need to have like files of disadvantages. So if you kind of remember yesterday's discussion on the K, disads could just be creatively named arguments, right? And that could just be a disadvantage to the affirmative, right? Don't just think disads as like the files, like the politics disad, those type of things. I put that there because those are kind of like traditionally used in policy debate, right? But since it's evolved, like disad just means like an argument against the affirmative, right? So good question. Michaela asked, why would we need to drop the counterplan? Is it to trick the app? Yes, right? You're negative, you want to win. You want to win, right? You just be like, app's bad, we do it better. Actually, these things, and the app has to just like answer all those things consistently, right? So dropping the CP is just really a negative strategy. This is why people run multiple off cases, right? So they run like 8 off, right? They only spend about like a minute or so each, or even less on each of those off cases, right? But that's in order to extend in the block, in order to really just like overwhelm the affirmative, right? So dropping something is strategic, right? Because if you think about the neg block being kind of like a veil for what they're going to be taking in the 2NR, you don't know how much time is going to, like, as a negative, you don't know how much the 1AR is going to answer, right? So if you make all of your arguments conditional, right, the most strategic way to go about that is to only take the arguments that the AF undercovered, right? So if the AF spent like the majority of the debate on the counterplan and disad, right, but they only spend like 30 seconds on T, and that was the whole 1NR, it would be more strategic to go for T, right, than the other arguments that has more answers to, right? So those are just really strategic reasons to drop the counterplan, right? Is to basically extend on the dropped answers that the 1AR did not extend or answer. Yeah.
If I could add on to that, I think that it's also a good idea to kick out of a counterplan or drop a counterplan when you realize it don't apply. You know, there may be a time where like you're moving fast, you know, we talk about you're excited, the way that maybe they didn't disclose the 1AC. And so you made a 1AC that you thought was as responsive to the 1AC as it could be. And then you realize the 2AC, they're like, counterplan doesn't solve the AFF. And you're like, it doesn't solve the AFF. What do I do? And now you've given them this moment where they can say, permutation, do the counterplan. It doesn't solve the AFF, but it does this other cool thing. So vote AFF, because like, you know, that counterplan is a good thing, but it doesn't challenge what we say needs to happen. So it would benefit you in that moment strategically to get rid of that counterplan, but also just in terms of how you thought about organizing the round, that's no longer effective. And it's okay to be like, I made a mistake. This is not going to win me the debate, but what can I do with what I have to still win this debate?
Yeah, that's really an excellent point. Like, people make this mistakes in debate all the time, right? And it's okay to be like, oh, right, wrong file. My bad, just kick out of that, right? Again, if you're in the neg, you kind of get to do those things. You get to contradict yourself. And honestly, it happens. Like, it happens all the time. Like, I remember one lambda debate in high school, I think I read the AF in the neg, or one way or the other. So, and I also, I think I told a story maybe to my lab, but I thought reading a disad just meant that you summarized the whole thing. So my first disad was like the Russian disad for like the nuclear or like the alternative energy topic. And I'm like, oh, here's the disad. I know what to do. I'm just going to summarize all these points. So it's okay. That's how you learn, because, you know, failure is life's hardest teacher. So how do you drop a CP? Oh, will you lose points for dropping it? So great question. You don't like, if you're the neg, like, you don't really lose point for dropping it. I feel like you would lose like secret points, or just the judge could be like, and if you had Devin in the back, you know, the faces that he makes. So like, it's really great to like also look at your judges, because I also make like really like expressive facial expressions. So yeah, you're not really going to lose points for doing it, because again, this is strategy for the negative. All right. I will say that you might lose points, or like I'm more likely to give you lower secret points, or vote for the affirmative if you kick, if you drop, or if you intentionally kick out of a counterplan that you're winning, right? So I just want to clarify the difference between dropping something and kicking out of something, because they're not interchangeable. When you drop something, right, that is usually an unintentional like consequence of you just not covering your arguments, right? So when you drop something, it's like, hey, they dropped this, they didn't cover that, they didn't have enough time, right? So that's usually like, aha, I got you moment. That's like an offensive argument that the opposing team should be pointing out, right? When you kick out of something, only the negative can kick out of something, because if you're the affirmative, you kick out, like, again, like, this could be a deeper conversation in lab, because I don't want to confuse y'all, but in policy debate, like, the affirmative gets to kick out of certain advantages, right? So if you have multiple advantages, like multiple things that you claim to solve for, you can kick out of some of those. We can have a deeper conversation about that maybe in our individual labs, but you don't lose points for kicking out of something, because kicking out of something is a deliberate and strategic choice on the negative's part, right? If you drop something and you're saying this other team dropped something, you're indicating to the judge that, hey, this is an argument they did not respond to, and we're extending those impacts, right? And you should not allow them to answer this because they dropped it, right? And that's the whole point of extending arguments in debate, and that's why you should be practicing your flow and just like flowing things across the board, because if you drop something, you can't really bring it up. I mean, you can bring it up, right? 2ARs lie all the time, right? But it's really up to the negatives to be like, again, protect the 2NR, right? We do not have a 3NR. If you remember like Brooke's lectures, Gabriella's lecture, they talk about like, you know, how ask cheat, right? So you want to just like remind the judge, especially negative. It's like, hey, do not vote on these things. They did not answer it, right? Because affirmative could be like, yeah, actually, here's a spin. We did answer that via this one argument that was probably on the flow, right? So as a negative, you need to be very like assertive and kind of straight on, like they dropped this argument, right? They kicked out of this, but they dropped this. They didn't answer it, right? You want to make it very clear to the judge, because if you're not very clear, it's really up to the judge to kind of like vote however they want, and usually a lot of debaters get frustrated with that because they're like, oh, well, we thought we were being very clear, but you don't know how your judges think and how they view the debate. So it's really important to make it easier for us, because it's very clear to be like, well, that's very clear to me. That's what I understood, so I'm voting on those things.
If I could add on real quick, is that like, so when you kick out of a counter plan, Leah's exactly right that you don't know how a judge might be considering things in debate. So you got to tell them. So when you decide to kick out of that counter plan, your language should be really specific as to why you're doing it, so that the other team can't just assert why you're doing it. So we know things about counterplan and counterplan conditionality, and different theoretical arguments that lying 2AC is going to bring up. So like, don't let them lie on you. If they're going to tell a story, they should be telling the story that is true for you. If you like, the debate is a place where we're here to learn. If you find out in this debate that the way that you're going about engaging in this conversation is no longer fruitful because it does not apply, I'm not going to keep going on with it. I won't just continue to do it because I got more information. I saw somebody share on Facebook this like little mantra that I'm trying to carry in my life, and it's also helpful for debate, is that normalize, you know, saying I don't have enough information, or I didn't have enough information, and so I did what I could with what I had. This is especially true when you're trying to bolster an argument about, like, so, you know, the example I gave a little bit earlier, let's say the affirmative didn't disclose. And so your 1 and C strategy is based off of as much of what you could have considered of the 1AC based off that time frame that you had to prepare. And so by the time that you're ready to kick out of the counter plan by the negative block or even by the 2NR, you can bolster the strength of that argument of like, I'm not kicking out of this solely for strategic purposes or to obscure this conversation. I just honestly didn't know that it didn't apply to the app. I thought it applied. I spent time to read it. I sacrificed my speech time because I thought this argument was good. But now that I see that it's no longer helpful or something that makes sense to me, I don't want to keep going on with it.
Honestly, I'm glad, Brooke, that you said that, because those things are things that we really need to practice, but a lot of debaters don't. They're just be like, yeah, we're kicking out of that. We're just going to be like hard pressed about just not admitting anything, because if you think that you're going to concede something, that means you're going to lose the round, right? And like, if y'all tuned into Brooke and I like self-care lecture on Monday, then you kind of know that like automatic negative thoughts and kind of like the way that we like converse with each other is very like kind of hostile outside of the debate round as well, right? So I'm really glad that thank you, Brooke, for bringing those things up, because it really gives us like an example to follow, right? And it's okay to admit those things, and judges are not going to fault you for that, because it's like, hey, we didn't know it applied. Okay, anything, you know, we're going to like be moving on, because again, if you're debating an affirmative where it's a little bit more like people are more emotionally invested in their affirmative, right? These things are very helpful because we're all human and we don't want to just engage each other like we're just like combative opponents. Like, we're all people.
Yep.
And considerate of feelings. So it's okay to admit those things, and they're not going to fault you. If anything, like, your opponent is probably going to feel a lot better. Like, feel
You get power.
Yeah.
You get a lot of power from that. There's respect in being able to say, I was wrong. And I still deserve to win because here's where I'm still right. You know, like, there are portions where I have been correct. I think that you made a good point here that made sense to me, made sense to the judge, but here's why I'm still winning.
Yeah, exactly. And like, there's only certain times when those things kind of like happen in round, but whenever somebody's able to kind of like own up and admit to that, I'm like, wow, that's them really kind of acknowledging and growing as a person. And if anything, like, we should all be kind of accountable, right? Because life isn't debate, and we have to like always win. Everybody is different, and we engage each other in different ways, right? So it's important to remind ourselves of that when we are debating and like even doing these practice debates, right? These the people that you engage with are not just like people, coaches, like all those roles. Like, we are human beings with feelings and lives. So please consider that and be mindful of that when you are debating. Let's see. Can you go more in deep about why it's kind of a big deal for the AF to not answer the question, what is the status of the counterplan? Okay, I guess like if y'all want to jump into this and like add as well. So the reason why this is kind of a big deal, or at least the way that I would see it as an opponent or as the judge, the AF should the AF should be asking what is the status of the counterplan again, right? Because if you don't ask that, then you're not holding the negative accountable to whether or not they have to decide is the counterplan conditional or unconditional. If you ask that like later on in a debate, or you'll argue that in the 1AR, it's like, oh, that conditionality is bad, right? If you didn't clarify that earlier on in the round, the negative team could just like make other arguments, right? But again, it's really important to talk about like the status of the counterplan, because it indicates to the affirmative, are you going to drop it in the 2NR or not? Are you going to extend it in the block or not? And if it is conditional, that means the negative team is telling you, it's like, we are not really sure if we really buy this counterplan. We don't really know how much we're going to invest the rest of our time and arguments on that counterplan. So it's conditional as of right now. So it's really important for the affirmative to at least clarify those things, because if you're debating teams with only like one or two off cases, right, and they could strategically allocate their time pretty evenly and cover all their bases, it's really important to know which argument they're kind of considering kicking out of, right, versus the other ones where you kind of like dead on know that they're going to be taking later on. So usually that really usually that would more so apply to, I really hear this question more, what's the status of the alt as well. So what's the status of the counterplan, or what's the status of the alt, is the same thing. They're just applied to the counterplan or the K, right? So counterplan and alt, if you switch it, is the same thing. They mean the same thing. So what's the status of the counterplan? What's the status of the alt? It's all it's asking is like, are you going to extend this in the block, in the 2NR, or are you possibly kicking out of it, right? So I hope that clarified your question.
While we're on the topic of status of the counterplan, we may want to answer this late question of, can you talk a little bit about a counterplan that's dispositional?
Oh yeah, great.
I can
go ahead.
Give a quick answer to that, which is dispo is a sort of, so if you're talking about status of the counterplan, dispo is kind of like a troll status. Like, it's not something that you should really take seriously, because it's just people trying to be shady. And I guarantee you, especially at like national circuit tournaments, if anybody says that to you, judges are gonna look at them kind of funny and be like, what? Because dispo means that it's unconditional unless the other team runs a permutation against it, in which case it switches to being conditional. And the sort of explanation for that is that if there's offense against the counterplan, then they make it conditional. But if there's not offense against it, then they make it unconditional. And there's no real reasoning behind that. That's usually communicated. It's just like, oh yeah, this is how it's gonna be because we think that's fair. But fairness doesn't really make any sense in that context, because it's about like what the implications of that are for the debate, and like what the reasoning behind it is. So like with unconditional things, it's like, oh, this is like actually a position that we're putting forward as a different advocacy that we're going to stick by because we really think that this is better than your plan. And with conditional ones, it's like, oh, we want to test your plan and see if these different things are better solutions. But with something that's dispositional, it's like, you're like, oh yes, this is a serious advocacy we're putting forward, but only until you run offense against it, and then we're gonna be sketchy and flip-flop. So you should just treat that like unconditional. You should just treat that like a conditional counterplan, and just talk about how dispositionality is a like sketchy, squirrely way to go. Yeah, you could, in that instance, I mean, it really depends. You should get them to define dispositionality if somebody says that against you, because some of them will say it's if you permit, and some of them will say if you have any offense against it. In which case, I guess they could count a turn as offense. But if it's like permutations only, then yeah, you could straight turn the counterplan and you'd be fine. That'd be kind of funny, and they deserve it.
Also, people peep when they don't know. Like, I promise you, there are like at least 65% of the people who are running something dispositionally are doing so because their coach sort of explained it to them, gave them a shell. If you continue to just kind of like ask a couple of more, like, these are the times where you have to think about where to use your cross-sec time strategically. If you think that like this could be an important part of the debate because they have a ton of off-case arguments and they're saying dispositionally, and you don't really know exactly what that means, and you don't think they're doing it in the way that Saya has explained, then you should ask some more questions. Make them clarify exactly what they think dispositionality is, explain what you think it is, and if it's good or not, or even if you think they're doing it, you know? Be able to challenge if they're doing dispositionality correctly, because I think that there's more room for contestation of that than there is for maybe conditionality.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely agree. And I also want to point out, like, what Brooke said, like, I actually didn't really know how to specifically define dispositionality. So, like, that's why I also reached out to Joel for help, because I was like, how do I explain these things, right? So this is like the explanation that he typed out, which I think is like super helpful. There are specific conditions under which the negative must commit to the counterplan. These conditions are not based on what the negative does, but which argument the AFF makes in the 2AC and the 1AR. In other words, if the AFF decides not to make these arguments, the neg must go for the counterplan. These specific arguments in question include 1, a permutation of any kind, 2, theory arguments saying the counterplan shouldn't be debated because it's unfair or educational. So if the AFF makes either of these arguments, the neg can explicitly concede them to kick the counterplan, just like you would concede there's no link to the plan, or to kick a disadvantage. Dispositionality is more risky to the negative than the conditionality, because it basically lets the AFF choose the 2 in our strategy. It doesn't make sense to read a counterplan dispositionality unless you're afraid of losing on conditionality is unfair or uneducational, right? So it's kind of like giving power back to the affirmative, and you're like, okay, well, if you decide that we shouldn't kick out of it, then I guess we shouldn't really kick out of it, and you're just kind of like, and you're also, you know, trying to be nice and just like let the affirmative decide whether or not they want to engage in the negative in those ways, right? So that could be another example of like why you'd be running like dispo or something. Because when I first heard dispo, I'm like, what is dispo, right? When you hear all these terms like condo, dispo, I had someone else try to explain it to me because I did not know what they meant. So it's okay to ask those questions. So again, thanks for reminding us of that, Brooke, because I also did not know those things.
And if you like what you've heard about dispositionality, don't be afraid to run it. Our personal perspective should not guide the decision-making practices that you might adopt. So if dispositionality sounds like something cool and useful to you, you can listen to the criticisms that maybe like some of the folks that have kind of just talked about it, like me, Saya, and Leah have kind of given our kind of positions on it. But you can kind of define it for yourself. What does it mean for the affirmative to test competition? Is there a certain standard, a litmus test? Is permutation, saying permutation do both, enough to test the competition of the counterplan with the affirmative? Like, you know, be creative with how you kind of consider some of these things that have existed in debate for a long time. You can personalize it and make it better, even if it doesn't exist in its best form now.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like, again, this is why we're saying that, like, again, your lab leaders, your educators are not all knowing beings. And even if we have like strong opinions, or maybe not so strong opinions, and we just have preferences, right? It doesn't make us right. It just makes us like informed about it just makes us informed about like what we'd like to, what our preferences are, right? So if you have us in the back of the room, maybe you know that our preferences like, okay, we're okay with this, but we're not, that we don't really buy it, right? So it's really just good to know those preferences, and it should not skew your opinion. You should be informed by multiple perspectives and decide that on your own, right? So yes. So I guess Jason asked, I have a question about the reform counterplan, like how as AF do we argue that case outweighs the human trafficking impact? I'm stuck on that a little bit, right? So again, kind of like the reform counterplan, I'm gonna upload these slides on Discord, but if you kind of like look back to that slide, it talks about how the reform counterplan is usually run with a crime decide, right? The crime decide will usually focus on kind of those things like human trafficking and things that are usually gross to contest, right? And justifications why we need certain enforcement agencies, right? So I doubt that a D team is going to be running things like we should criminalize more people or put more people in prison, right? If anything, they'd argue that we need to reform these institutions, these enforcement institutions, because there are real criminals that need to be caught, right? So that's why they want to not abolish, they want to reform, right? So that's usually how you would usually have a dissent that says that we need this enforcement agency because of like this moral high ground. That's usually just to help people. So for example, if we don't have a certain agency, if we don't have a certain agency to investigate these things, then you know who's going to be investigating those missing children or people who have been kidnapped, right? It's like we need some government agency to for oversight and to do those things because private citizens cannot, right? So that's usually the gist of what the crime decide would entail, or like the substance of those arguments are with the reform counterplan, right? It's usually not to be like, yeah, we should keep things as is because like it works, right? It's usually something more of like along those lines of arresting like the bad people, like murderers and rapists and like sexual abuse, like those morally questioned like beings. Usually that's the focus on the crime DA. How would you phrase kicking out of certain arguments? Nuriel asks. That is a great question, right? It really kind of depends on how you want to go about this, right? You can, so when you are giving a roadmap, so again, if you're kind of in JB and kind of needed this, I also didn't really know what a roadmap was or know how to kick out of something. So when you would be kicking out of something, let's say that you have, if you are the 2NR, right? And you have 5 off cases, right? The way that I would be like ordering it, and to me it would make sense as the judge, if you're going to be kicking out of something or not spending a lot of time, you would put the argument that you're kicking out of in the first part. So you're going to talk about like, if you're going to be kicking out of a reform counterplan, you'd say reform counterplan, crime DA, the K, you know, the other K and case, right? So in that order, because I know that, you know, that's going to be first, I'm kind of expecting you to either lightly go over it or just to kind of get it out of the way, right? Usually that's the kind of first part of the speech. It should be a brief overview, and you could be like, okay, we are kicking out of the reform counterplan. Then you'd make an argument. It's like, you know, it's a test of competition. We agree it's like it doesn't apply or whatever else, like don't consider that. And then you just put your flow down, right? So that would be like one way of like kicking out of something. Just organizing your flow before your speech, right? You could do this in the 2NR, you could do this in like the 2NC or like the 1NR, right? So you could just kind of phrase it in that way and just give reasons why the judge shouldn't vote down the neg. It's like, it doesn't apply, okay, we're just moving on to these other arguments. You just want to make it clear that you are kicking out of something and not dropping something, because even if you drop something or drop a case, sometimes the affirmative could use that against you and just like spin that in a way that would work in their favor. So it's really good to be clear about whether or not you are kicking out of something versus dropping something. You want to be very intentional when you're saying you are kicking out of this argument, and you want to give the justification about why you are kicking out of this argument and like why we shouldn't be voted down for that, right?
I'd also add that when you're kicking out of arguments, you don't necessarily have to put them first in terms of like your roadmap and things you're getting to in the speech. especially if you are confident that you're going to be able to time your speech well and like pace yourself, it can be a little bit more, I don't know, like impactful to a judge to hear you like go over the argument that you're most invested in first, and that's like the most important to you because you have their attention at the beginning of the speech, and then maybe kicking an argument next because you don't want to leave it to last because then it sounds like you just like ran out of time and kicked it. But like you don't necessarily have to put it first as long as you're not leaving it to the very end of the speech. And then, like Leah said, just making sure that you get rid of any offense on the argument is also important. So like that's like conceding the permutation and saying it's a test of competition. Or if there's any turns on the counterplan, you do need to answer those before you kick it, because if you kick it without answering the offense counts as being dropped and the AF team can still bring it up, even if you've kicked out of the argument itself, because they still have offense on that flow.
If I can make a suggestion, this is like something that I think that it's good to try out. Like, I think it's good to determine what is your, like, you know, we have these practice debates that are coming up in your rounds where you're negative. I would just try out what feels comfortable, what feels authentic, and what feels strategic, you know? Like, strategy at the end of the day, you know, that's still a part of the game, right? Like, and so you still want to be able to win. You want to be able to win ethically, right? So, like, honestly, I think that, like, if I like, in terms of, like, what might be a good way to try things out is I would definitely put, like Saya suggested, put the arguments that I'm going for and I think are the most persuasive at the top. And, you know, make sure you get to the part that you want to kick out. I probably would put it at the bottom. I would put it at the bottom, but if I put it at the bottom, I'd have to have a well thought out explanation as to why I'm kicking out of it that is connected ultimately to the thing that I want the judge to be most focused on. And so I think that just requires, because like debate is a communication activity. You know, if you want somebody to understand what you're communicating to them, you obviously might want to start out with the thing that is most important to you. And if there's something that we need to let go, something that you brought up, be okay with explaining, hey, these are the things that are most important to me. And while this other thing at the end of your speech was important, here is why it is no longer important to this conversation. And here's why the offense that they explain, because you do, like Saya said, have to deal with that offense. Here's why the offense that they said is no longer relevant to the debate.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I want to also just point out, like, what I said earlier is definitely also a preference and also just something I've traditionally seen debaters do, or just like seen a lot, at least in my round, right? They're definitely both correct that you want to be mindful about how you debate, right? And what is best for you. For example, when I started, when I was still learning how to debate, I was very wrong in how long my overviews are, right? My overviews were basically a couple minutes long and they really shouldn't be that long, right? But I really didn't know how to debate, and sometimes you just have to mold to whatever is comfortable for you. So if kicking out of something and just, you want to get that out of your head and just like kind of move on and just like explain that so you could really get into the substance, then go ahead and do that. We're just trying to clarify that you just need to make it very clear to the judge what order you're going in. So for example, if you want to do what Saya and Brooke said, right, which is really great, and what you should be doing in the beginning of your speeches, right, is kind of have a short overview about, like, here, I'm just going to remind you of the important arguments and kind of like frame my speech about how you should be approaching or listening to the rest of my speech, right? And here are the more important arguments. Then you would kind of get into explaining your arguments or kicking out of something. And I also want to explain that, like, also what Brooke said and also what Saya said, if you leave it last, right, sometimes that could also be a strategy to, if you allocate your time efficiently and you already timed yourself, right, it could just be another way to waste the AFFS time, because they think that traditionally, again, if you leave it last, you're probably going to be talking about it, right? So so if you kind of undercover it or you just are kicking out of it, then the affirmative could be prepping during that time and could be allocating a lot of time to answering an off case that, you know, your partner hasn't read yet, right, but you've been preparing for. and they're anticipating you to just like drop it or undercover it, but it's a strategic decision for the neg to be like, oh yeah, 30 seconds left. Yeah, we're kicking out of this, and then you explain your offense, and then you kick out, right? That could be a great way to kind of like waste AFF time. I've also seen that in around, right? Because of the traditional thinking of like, well, you would put the things that you kick out first in the beginning of the debate, right? Again, this is why you should be considering your own strategies as a neg, and always molding those strategies in round, right? Because every round change, every tournament changes, and debate is not static, right? You do what works for you, and the feedback you get from judges, and also like how you engage with other debaters will always shape and transform the way that you're debating. So don't feel stuck in old ways because of how you've been trained or like the preferences of your lab leaders or anything like that, right? Do what works for you and like whatever helps you learn best and debate better, right? There's no really correct way to debate-ish. Just be a good person, be a good human. Great. Can you talk a little bit more? Okay, we'll talk about the dispo part. Do you think the reform counterplan is more competitive than decay? This, if you want to specify what you mean by that, right, it really depends on the debate. That depends on how you argue it, right? I don't think that anything is more competitive than anything. It really just depends on how it's argued. So, really anything goes. If you have a judge that prefers K's over counterplans, then maybe you want to read a K. If you have a judge that prefers counterplans over K's, then you might want to read a counterplan, right? Again, debate is about spin. And even if these arguments are kind of similar, like the abolition CP could be the abolition K, for example, right? And the structure and the arguments are similar. They're just called different things, right? Or they could have different actors. So yeah, so I don't, at least for me, I don't really have a preference for like what is more competitive, right? It just really kind of depends on how it's debated, the substance of the debate, and like the arguments that are presented.
I definitely think that Leah's right, where it might be contingent on the judge. And like when you don't know things about the judge, it's good to just kind of err on what your feelings are about for the tournament. Like, is this a more traditional tournament where people are more cautious to experimentation in terms of styles in debate? Like, maybe NSDA or something like that, where it's like maybe different kind of stakes. So I would kind of consider based off of that, because if their arguments are fundamentally the same thing or just about, then you know that it's not about what you will say. Your research still matters. It's about how you present that to your audience. So when you don't know your audience, you have to err on what you know about the general audience. And if you can find specific information for your audience that is more, pertinent than the general, then always defer to that.
The other thing I would say about that too is, like, even if you're in a situation where you're like, okay, I think that this judge would really prefer this argument, but you feel much more confident about another argument and you think that you can debate another argument much better, always go with what you think is going to be the stronger argument for you. Unless you're like iffy about both of them, and then just like go with what you think the judge will like. But like, if you feel really strongly that one argument is better than the other and that you can debate one better than the other, then go with what you know best, because you'll debate it better. Yeah. So.
Agreed. But if there's a way that you can package an argument that you know is like the same, then I would definitely try to package it. And like if I told my mom, hey mom, like I don't know, if I told my mom like, hey, like I want to be like really like experimentative or whatever, just like if I told her I would tell her a way about things about myself in a way that I think she can understand. It's still like about what I'm trying to do for my life. It still is like hold to myself, right? Like I'm still in line with my beliefs about the things, but I am packaging it and I'm using language that I think is similar to yours, right? Like you should not definitely just veer to like the, what? You like racism. I'm racist now. Like, no, you want to, if your argument is is some kind of reform that is similar to the critique, if you think that the argument will be best served in the form of a counterplan and the content is still functionally the same, then go ahead and feel comfortable with experimenting in that style so that you can attain that kind of versatility. But you still should have a foundational ethics and conversation about what you feel comfortable with, what you have been researching, because you will remain confident and be ultimately more persuasive in a position to win if you have that foundation to look back on or fall back on.
Yeah, thank you, Brooke, for like especially clarifying and adding that, right? It's really important to, I'm glad that you keep bringing up that debate shouldn't really impede on your own personal ethics, right? And it should, you just shape your perspective. So like Brooke said, if your judge is more likely to kind of maybe vote for the counterplan or the K, right? I've at least had debaters say that like, oh, well, I don't really want to run a counterplan because everything I've heard from varsity debaters is counterplan is bad because it uses the USFG and the USFG is bad, and we're going to link to all these K debates because we use the USFG, right? That's usually the gist of, and just really the entirety of what they know or understand about these type of counterplans. So Brooke is absolutely right. You should feel free to experiment with these type of arguments because if the substance is the same, you're just packaging it in a different way that people will understand, right? So if it's a policy judge, you're basically saying the same things, but you know the structure of a counterplan. You know the type of words and type of rhetoric that will make them vote for you, right? If you have a more K-leaning judge, right? Think about the structure of a K, right? Think about yesterday's lecture, right? So you just need to adapt your arguments in forms that the judges are going to be more receptive to, or they're more likely to vote for, right? Because they're all kind of like essentially the same, but you just have to understand how they function in debate and how they're just a little bit different in terms of the arguments that could apply to them, right? So again, don't be scared because, you know, counterplan says USFG should do this or like abolish or, you know, anything like that. If the substance is the same, just be grounded in your own knowledge and what you know about the topic, because if you don't know if you don't believe your own arguments, and if you are always questioning it, the judge will probably question it too, because you know that's part of ethos. That's part of how you have to present your arguments. If you don't believe it, or at least don't fake it till you make it, right? Then I'm probably leaning toward the person that is more confident. And sometimes it'd be like that. Sometimes look at, you know, politics, right? That's how people are won over, because someone is a better public speaker or more confident, right? But if you're kind of lacking that, I lacked that a lot, and I had to learn a lot of, you know, being assertive and having more confidence in college when I had to kind of be thrown into college policy debate, right? So don't be scared of exploring those new things. Everything is debatable, and if they're saying that you're wrong, that's debatable too. Just ground yourself in what you know, and also just ask if you don't know, right? Everybody's learning. Don't be intimidated by asking questions. Yes. Oh, maybe Saya, you can kind of help me answer this question, because I am also a little bit new to dispo, right? Can y'all talk a little bit about counterplan as dispositional, so we can just straight turn the CP and we should be fine? I think I have a general answer to this understanding, but maybe Saya, you want to kind of take this or explain a little bit more?
I think we talked about that briefly earlier, but I think what Brooke was saying is really the best advice in that situation, which is really try to narrow down what they're defining dispositionality as, and like sort of what their form of dispositionality is. And in most cases, that would be a really good strategy against them, to try and trap them in a straight turn and make it so that they can't kick the counterplan, because then they have to go for the counterplan. Any other offense they have, they'll have to kick in favor of the counterplan, so they have to spend time answering it. But make sure beforehand that you know what they mean by dispositionality and what they will or will not kick the argument in that situation.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but for it to be for the negative to have to go for this for argument that they're running dispositionally, the affirmative has to have only offense.
Wait. That.
Deliberation, y'all.
So,
we don't have everything.
Because if they
right.
Because if they do a permutation or like theory arguments, those are offense. And those are usually the situations where they'll kick it
A perm is defense, in my opinion, unless there's like I feel like perm generically is like defense, and there's times when a permutation can be offensive.
The perm is defense in the way that it like tends to be applied, but there's a reason why people just say the perm is a test of competition when they kick it, I think, which is that teams can try and make it into an offensive argument and try to like steal the counterplan with it.
Yeah, I feel like there has to be an explanation in the 2AC though. I would push for that as a negative though too. Like there has to be like an explanation in the 2AC about the permutation that signifies the offensive element, not just that the permutation can exist. Like these things can happen at the same time, but it is necessary that they happen at the same time, and we only know that because the negative introduced that to the debate.
Yeah. And that's why I think dispositionality is mostly just like a very sketchy way to like have that be the status of your counterplan, because they do count perms as offense, and it's like unless you make entirely defensive arguments, they're like, oh, then we can kick it. And it's just to try and trap the affirmative into making it conditional while saying that it's not as unfair as conditionality. Which is why you just have to make sure that you know what they're defining dispositionality as.
Agreed.
Seems like the chat kind of quieted down. Do you all have any questions? We have about 6 minutes left before lunch, so please ask questions, or we can kind of sit here quietly and awkwardly and look at our screens until somebody kind of pops up, right? But we're gonna be here on screen until somebody says something, and we're gonna like bounce for lunch. But if y'all wanna just like look at our pretty faces, I know Devin doesn't mind being on camera. He loves being on camera. We're going to be here until like 12, so please feel free to just like message us, or if you are afraid of your question, DM us in the chat, and then we could go read it. Or not, or just like chill.
Is there another lecture today?
There's a Decide lecture that Joseph B will be giving after lunch.
Yes, Decide.
Egg muffin. Oh God, that debate.
Don't start that again.
Oh God, is Jasmine? Oh God. We'll get started.
What?
They'll go over lunch.
Oh, the egg muffins. I'm sure she still has some.
Question. What would y'all like to see? I guess like while we're waiting. What would y'all like to see on like Lambda TikTok, or just like general TikTok? No, I'm not dancing. No one's dancing, right? Like, what would you like to see? We have a TikTok reserved. It's like Lambda debate, right? But like that's how the kids learn. We haven't posted anything yet, but we plan to be posting stuff. You know, maybe like 1 minute self-care tips. You know, throughout the season. Yeah. So like that'd be really dope. So what? Yeah, we do have a TikTok at Lambda debate. We haven't like launched it yet because like millennials on TikTok. I will say that I'm still trying to figure it out. So if any of y'all would like, I will probably reach out to team captains or other folks in the fall to help me with some TikTok content to like help your millennial mom out. Yeah, so what would y'all like to see on there? I know the reason why I asked, because I think it's a really great platform for educational purposes. I learned a lot. Like I see professionals on there, like there's lawyers and doctors, there's like like there's so many like people just informing in under a minute, and like I feel like that's how we learn now. Are you the first follower? I don't know if we actually have it, but if you are, yay. We haven't posted anything yet, but I think we will. So we don't want to be lame in, you know, but what would you all like to see there? I kind of wanted to make it like shorter and faster content instead of longer YouTube videos, or just kind of like maybe quick summaries. But is that kind of whack, or would you all like to see something else, or you're just like Lambda shouldn't be on TikTok? Y'all are really gonna leave me hanging on that last part, huh? Like no, it's okay. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your honesty.
There's a question.
Okay, what is it?
Can you make a brief explanation of the types of counterplans you mentioned earlier? 1, reform counterplans. 2, abolition counterplans. 3, aging counterplans, and how to use them.
Sure. So I guess if I could just share screen, maybe I can just put that here. Got it. No. Let me put this up. I like visuals, so sorry if it's like taking a little bit. I feel just still getting the hang of
I think that's a good idea. Those are 3 counterplans, and there's 2 parts to that question.
Yeah. Can you all see my screen now, or the presentation? Yeah. Okay, cool. So it says a brief explanation again, like if y'all want to kind of screenshot this or just kind of save this, this will also be uploaded. But reform counterplans, they're usually reforming whatever part of the affirmative that like you're competing against, right? So instead of abolishing whatever plan that the affirmative is presenting, you would say we need to reform that agency instead of like abolishing it. So for example, like we should abolish ICE. It's like we can just reform ICE because again, you gave an example of how ICE helps people and find that kind of example. Second, abolition counterplans. These are examples to reform counterplans, right? So these usually link better to like institutions that are just like beyond reform. So for example, if you have like body cams, for example, right? Body cameras are a type of like local reform. So instead of just like, hey, we should reform body cams, that just also clarifying when you reform something, or at least a lot of evidence, you're investing more money into those institutions because reforming something means like we need to restructure, we need to retrain, all those type of things. So the abolition argument is like, hey, we should get rid of those institutions and allocate other funds to allocate funds to other resources, right? So abolition counterplan would be instead of reforming ICE via this specific plan or policy, we should just abolish ICE because it is a bad institution and like Fast and Furious is older than that. Like I just want to keep throwing that out there because that is ridiculous. Right, and then agent counterplan, how to use them. Again, please feel free to kind of like screenshot this because like for me, I like visuals and so it's like very helpful for me to at least kind of see from a glance, right? 50 states. These kind of agent counterplans would be, again, really if the affirmative doesn't specify the USFG, or it just says the whole USFG as a whole, right? Just like the federal government. So you would just say 50 states counterplan would apply because you know, the states do it better and local authorities are more likely to enforce and implement those laws, and also like you know, states know their people better. Supreme Court counterplan, you'd read this if the plan is passing something by a Congress, right? If they want to have something written into law and their plan includes the word Congress. The Supreme Court counterplan applies to this because the argument is that Supreme Court justices are shielded from political pressure, whereas the Congress members aren't, right? We elect them, and you know, there are cases where they're corrupt or insider trading, kind of those type of things. The argument is that the Supreme Court is more legitimate because they have those positions for life, and it's not self-serving. So when they make decisions, they're independent from other like public scrutiny because at least their jobs are not in danger, right? So that's the Supreme Court counterplan. Congress counterplan, again, this is what you would use this against an affirmative that uses the Supreme Court as an actor, right? So if it says the Supreme Court should do this or Supreme Court should rule this, you would run a Congress counterplan because the argument of the Congress counterplan is saying that the plan is too political and it hurts the court's legitimacy, right? I think I maybe heard about this like early on, but like people back then would say that like same-sex marriage was too political and was too political for the courts to decide, right? So I guess I'm just using that as an example because when people question the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, right? that's kind of like questioning the function of democracy and like the political process. So it's usually read with the court legitimacy does that, right? Because the main argument there is that we don't elect the Supreme Court officials, right? We elect people who pick that person, right? So if anything, we are not really part of those democratic processes, whereas we can pressure and we can convince our Congress members to pass certain laws, or at least hold them accountable by, threatening to vote them out, right? So it's really good to kind of like at least have these things handy, just so you know what type of affirmative they're applying to, but just be aware of the type of agent, right? And the main arguments.
Oh, but Leah, so I wanted to chime in really quickly about the Supreme Court one, because like I remember when I was in high school, I loved the Supreme Court counterplan and also just the Supreme Court in general until it has fundamentally changed the way it is now. But whatever. The thing is like there's another diss ad that people sometimes have run that is on along the lines of the stuff that you were saying, when you were saying things were too political. This ad is called judicial activism. And it's just like pretty much people say that when judges are trying to rule on cases that are really going beyond the interpretation of the Constitution and making decisions on things that are politically activist, that is bad because of like just a litany of reasons. Especially one of the main examples people use is that if the activism was not liberal and it was on the other end of the spectrum, that could start to peel back certain civil liberties or civil rights. And that's why judicial activism for either side would be a very slippery slope. So we can't advocate for it in some ways. So I'm pretty sure judicial activism might be a diss ad on this topic, maybe. I would think, because if it includes anything about the Supreme Court. But it just talks about how the judiciary will not have a lot of restraint on the decisions that they make, pretty much. So I don't know, that could be a thing.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I typed that in the notes because I didn't want to forget it, but I will definitely add that in the presentation. So thank you for bringing that up, Devin. I know that we're going a little bit over time, so I hope that this presentation was helpful and useful. At one, we're going to have the Decide lecture by Joseph B. Just stay tuned for the Zoom link there, and then the time left over, we're going to be in lab. So if there's any other questions, please feel free to just like compile those questions so we could answer them in lab. They're very helpful for us, and if there's anything that we need to explain more, please ask your lab leaders. We do not mind at all. That's what we're here for, and we're all here to learn. So have a good lunch break, y'all. I will be ending this meeting, and hope y'all take a break, and thank you for participating. Bye.